Thank you, Professor Carson, and thank you to the University of Tulsa and the National Energy Policy Institute for organizing this conference and for inviting me. Today I want to take a look back at OPEC. I want to give an overview of the forest going back into the 1960s. Taking a look at world aggregates, world consumption, broken down by several regions, the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Europe, North America, industrialized Asia. Take a look at production broken down by OECD, former Soviet Union, OPEC, and rest of the world. Also want to take a look at projections for the future going out to 2030 by the organizations that do this, the U.S. Department of Energy, DOE, International Energy Agency in Paris, BP, ExxonMobil, and OPEC itself makes projections. I want to take a look at those. I want to review what their similarities are, what their differences are, and also take a look back at some previous projections just to give us some context. The third thing I want to do is to sort of review some work that I've done to try to analyze the question of what we might expect from OPEC. This is a question that I've worked on for a long time, and so I want to present some of these results to give you a sense as to sort of what my own views are in terms of what we can expect from OPEC in the future. I'm going to break the last 50 years into maybe 5 or 6 periods of unequal length and take a look at how well OPEC did in terms of its own interests, managing its own interest, and in particular, although they did spectacularly well in the 1970s, they did not do very well in the early 1980s, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I've mentioned the long-term projections. We'll discuss those. So this is an outline of what I'm going to be doing in the next 40 minutes or so. So the first part is this retrospective going back to 1960. And basically what I did is I went out and I took the data from British Petroleum. It's out on the internet. It's available in big worksheet. It's very accessible. So this is the data broken down into consumption and production by these regions that I've mentioned. We have the, this is world production, total world production. This is OECD production. This is former Soviet Union production, rest of the world, and OPEC production in here. This is broken down individually. These ones are stacked vertically. Basically, you can see that rest of the world production sort of declined in the 80s, early 90s. That was mostly a decline in former Soviet Union, and it's increased since then, although it may have reached a peak. We're not sure yet in 2004, 2008. This is world consumption. We see that OECD and former Soviet Union comprised the vast majority of world consumption 40, 50 years ago. And the rest of the world, Asia, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and so forth, were a very small part of world consumption in 1965, but now they are a very substantial part of world oil consumption. So that's the basic data on the consumption and production side. This is the data with respect to the price of crude oil in real terms, 2009 dollars. This is OPEC oil exports broken down into Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the Emirates, Iran, Iraq, and everybody else. This is exports, not domestic consumption. I'll talk about that in some detail. Domestic consumption in OPEC 40 years ago, 50 years ago, was only 1 million barrels a day. Now it's 8 million barrels a day. It's a very substantial part of their production. It's 25% of their production. This is their export revenue over the last 45 years. Big peak in 73, 74, again 1980, fell off substantially in the 80s and 90s, and in the recent price increase, it's gone back up to where it had been. This is OPEC and Saudi Arabia's share of the not of the world market, but of the non-OPEC market. It had reached 50% in the early 1970s, fell off sharply in the early 80s after the 79-80 price increase, and gradually it has recovered. Now it's about 37%, something like that. This is the share of Saudi Arabia on the range of 10–12%. I want to go through some graphs that simplify even further, and I just want to distinguish between OPEC and non-OPEC. So OPEC is who we think they are. Non-OPEC is everybody else. It's the OECD countries, it's the rest of the world, it's former Soviet Union. And so these are the numbers that we have from British Petroleum. I'll break it down into individual yearly components, but this is what I want to go through for the next few minutes. If we focus on the first 10 years or 12 years of OPEC's existence, what we see at the start is that the oil companies, the international oil companies, were the ones in control. They controlled the prices, they determined where they would lift their oil. They owned the resources in these countries, typically. But in the period prior to 1973, the call on OPEC oil production from these OPEC countries was growing about 10% annually. That 10% annual growth is basically unsustainable. And we know the spike in prices happened in 73, 74. But I think if that had not happened, sooner or later, there was so much upward pressure on the demand for OPEC oil that a 10% growth rate was just not sustainable. So we have this sea change starting in 1971. We know what happened in 73, 74. OPEC quadrupled the price of oil. Over that period, they started to determine their own export levels and nationalize their own oil resources. From their perspective, this period was a spectacular success, okay? This was a spectacular success for OPEC up through 73. 1976, they basically consolidated their power. They waited out a recession in 74, 75. The demand for their oil started to grow, the demand for their oil started to grow again in 76, 77, 78. Prices stabilized, revenue stabilized. Their share of the market fell off a little bit, but by and large, in the mid-70s, they consolidated the gains from the 73, 74 price increase. 1978, at the end of 1978, the revolution in Iran began. Oil field workers went on strike. Iranian production went from 6 million barrels a day to nothing. Oil prices doubled in 79, 80. At the end of 1980, Iraq attacked Iran, the two of them knocking out each other's production and exports. So very disruptive period, 79, 80, 81. I'm going to argue that the big error that OPEC made and took a long time to recover from was keeping price too high in 1981 through 85. I think the price increase in 79, 80 was likely to be supportable if you sort of analyze it. If the loss of Iranian production, Iran-Iraq war, prices were going to have to go higher. But the problem for OPEC was that they kept prices too high for too long in 82, 83, 84. And what's happening is that although prices are coming down slowly, the demand for their exports is collapsing. It had been close to 30 million barrels a day. It gets down to 15 million barrels a day. They're trying to restrain their output. There's a lot of cheating going on within OPEC. It turns out to be unsustainable. Okay, they cannot restrain output that long. Saudi production goes to less than 3 million barrels a day. By the end of 1985, the Saudis basically say that this is not sustainable anymore. They are going to increase production. They increase production from 3 to 5 to 6. Oil prices collapse between 85 and 86. This period, 81 through 85, I would argue is a terrible miscalculation by OPEC. I'll talk a little bit about why they did it, sort of how do I understand sort of what happened. This is a slightly different graph. I'll come back to this in more detail later on. This, for me, is the most compact way I can summarize what's happening in the world oil market. I have the same horizontal axis on both graphs. This is OPEC exports, and I have the same horizontal axis for both graphs. On the vertical, up here I have crude oil price. On the vertical here I have non-OPEC oil supply. In the top graph, I have these dashed lines, or what are called ISO revenue curves. So this is $100 billion a year. This is $400 billion a year. This is $700 billion a year. In the bottom graph, we have OPEC exports. We have non-OPEC oil supply. These diagonal rays from the origin are OPEC's share of the world oil, OPEC's share of non-OPEC demand. So this is 30% of demand, this is 40%, 50% of demand. And if you go out in this direction, these dashed lines are telling you how much non-OPEC demand is, because you've got the two components. You've got OPEC exports and you've got non-OPEC supply. So this is 60 million barrels a day of non-OPEC demand. This is 80 million barrels a day of non-OPEC demand. So this, that picture tells you the same information that we had on the previous graph. What we have is rapid increase in OPEC exports from 65 to 73, a big increase in price 73, 74, another big increase in price 79, 80, big increases in OPEC revenue, and then the demand for OPEC oil and the price starts falling. This is where they are in 1985. In terms of the quantities, big increase in OPEC exports, slight increase vertically in non-OPEC supply, big reduction in OPEC exports between 80 and 85. Demand falls, non-OPEC supply is increasing. This period from 80 to 85 is really a disaster for OPEC. It takes 2 decades basically to recover from this, and OPEC kept its price relatively low for a long period of time, and its demand for its exports increases gradually. Non-OPEC supply flattens out, partly because of declines in the Soviet Union. Non-OPEC demand starts increasing gradually. So we see that the demand for OPEC exports goes from 15 million barrels a day back up to 26, 27 over a decade or so, and it stays there for a while. This is the same kind of a graph showing what happens in the roughly 2-decade recovery from 85 to 2003.